officials. A spokesperson for Gaza's Hamas-run civil defence agency said 20 bodies, including children, were recovered from the school, many of them severely burned, after fires engulfed 2 classrooms which had been turned into living quarters. A little bit earlier on, we heard from Eylon Levy, who is a former spokesperson for the Israeli government.
Unfortunately, this war could have ended on October 8th, immediately after Hamas launched it, if the leaders who launched that barbaric attack on Israeli civilians agreed to put down their arms, leave power, and hand back the hostages who are being starved and tortured in the dungeons of Gaza. This is a horrific war. And it's a horrific war because of Hamas's deliberate strategy of fighting inside and under civilian areas, out of school buildings, out of hospitals, out of UN facilities, out of mosques. Hamas, the government of Gaza, militarized the entire landscape of the Gaza Strip in order to hide under civilians and in order to try to maximize civilian casualties on their own side. They're quite open about seeing civilians as martyrs. I think it's tragic. I think it's deeply sad. And I think the United Nations should support Israel's efforts to try to get uninvolved civilians out of Hamas strongholds so that Israel can target Hamas terrorists without civilians in the way, instead of impeding their safe evacuation.
So you hear news of 9 children being killed in one family because of an Israeli airstrike. You hear of children hungry and dying because of an Israeli blockade on aid, and you don't lay any blame at all at the feet of the Israeli government for how they're executing this war.
This is a war that Israel didn't start, didn't want, and
it doesn't matter about
expect.
starting it, but just on how they're doing it.
Well, it's a war that we have to understand the rules of engagement that Israel is fighting in. These aren't 2 medieval armies facing face to face on a battlefield. Hamas has deliberately placed its military positions within schools and hospitals and mosques and UN facilities. That is the reality of the battlefield in Gaza. And Hamas does that because it leaves Israel with 2 choices. Either Israel attacks legitimate military targets, doing everything it can under international law to mitigate harm to civilians, and then we get headlines like that, children killed in school building, or Israel backs off and gives Hamas the permanent immunity it seeks in order to continue waging war against Israel, shooting missiles at Israeli cities. It is important to understand that this is a battlefield that Hamas has deliberately manufactured in order to maximize.
So your point is that is a completely reasonable outcome of war then? 9 children dead in one family, children hungry and dying. That is war.
Nothing about war is reasonable. War is horrific. That's why it's important that this war end. And this war must end with the release of the hostages who have been shackled in dungeons under Gaza for 600 days, and with the defeat of Hamas. Because if this is not the last Gaza war, this is the point I want to emphasize. If this war does not end with the defeat of Hamas, there will be a next Gaza war. And the next Gaza war will be worse because Hamas will feel that its strategy of hiding inside and under civilian buildings has been vindicated. And we don't want that in Israel. We don't want to return to another round of fighting in Gaza. Israel wants this to be the last Gaza war, and it wants it to be the last Gaza war with the hostages home and the monsters who launched the October 7th massacre removed from power.
We had a number of European...
We're also hearing from many people in Gaza.
Yes, we had a number of European and Arab countries meeting in Madrid on Sunday to discuss all of this, and one of the outcomes of that was Spain calling for sanctions on Israel. They said the way that Israel is executing this war is inhumane and senseless. You'll have heard the previous criticism from people like the UK Prime Minister, amongst others, last week. Do you think any of that will have a bearing on how Israel approaches this?
No, because Israel is fighting this war so that we don't have more rockets being fired from the Gaza Strip at our cities like it has over the last 20 years. Israel is fighting because we don't want to take the risk of a jihadi army invading, massacring, raping, and burning people at a music festival again. These are, as far as Israelis are concerned, the odds. We are fighting to prevent another October 7th
But my
massacre.
question was more so, my question there was more a diplomatic one, not about necessarily the ins and outs of what is happening, but more, do you think that this kind of pressure from allies, to all intents and purposes, will actually sway Israeli policy or no?
I think this sort of pressure is fundamentally misguided because anything that weakens Israel strengthens Hamas and makes a hostage deal less likely. Hamas looks at European politicians debating in whatever summit they're holding, and concludes that if it drags out this war, if it continues its strategy of fighting inside civilian facilities, then it will have diplomatic pressure placed against Israel. And that encourages Hamas to keep fighting. It's a fundamentally misguided and counterproductive strategy that is prolonging and extending this war.
That is Eylon Levy, a former spokesperson for the Israeli government. There's plenty more on what is happening in Gaza at bbcnews.com. The AFP news